So let's take a look at what we're going to need for our celestial curve. We're going to need some boning. This will go in your strap to hold it upright. If you don't have boning or don't wish to obtain it, then I suggest cutting an extra strap support and using 2 of those. It won't be quite as upright or stiff as what it would be with the boning, but it hopefully will do the job for you. You're going to need to cut 1 of those if you have the boning, or 2 if you don't. So that's the strap support. Decaville heavy. We need a Decaville heavy base support, 1 of, and we apply that during construction, so you can possibly put it onto the gusset when you've made your gusset, but I prefer to add it a bit later because it's easier to sew the bag without that in place earlier. But we'll go through that as we go through the instructions. A strap, we need 1 exterior and 1 interfacing. I have already fused that there, so you need to cut 1 of those. Strap cuffs, we need 4 exterior and 4 interfacing. I have already fused that. Now if you're making this from leather or vinyl, I suggest you probably won't need the interfacing on that, or at least not into the seams. For our zipper gussets, we need to cut 2 exterior, 2 lining and 2 interfacing. 2 exterior, 2 lining and 2 interfacing, and as you can see I've already fused those. Your gussets, your exterior gussets, you're going to need to cut 2 exterior, 2 interfacing and 2 of the stabilizers, fleece, and an extra 2 interfacing of this, especially if you're using quilting cotton. It'll give you a really nice structure with the extra interfacing in there. The exterior, we need to cut 2 exterior body, 2 interfacing and 2 fleece and 2 extra interfacings for those. And as you can see, I've already fused that in place. For your linings, you're going to need 2 slip pocket pieces, 1 lining, 1 exterior and 2 interfacing. I like to have a band at the top of my pocket, that's why I've done it this way. If you wish to have all lining or all exterior, that's up to you. For your zipper pocket, you need 2 lining, 2 interfacing, as you can see it's already fused, and a zipper pocket facing of 1 lining and 1 interfacing. For your gussets, lining gusset, you need to cut 2 lining and 2 interfacing. For your lining body, you need to cut 2 lining and 2 interfacing. And as you can see, I've already fused it. Now you're going to need a piece of number 3 zipper cut to 8 inches or 20 centimeters and a zipper pull. And you need a number 5 zipper, 13 inches or 33 centimeters. And a zipper pull. Don't put that zipper pull on yet, we'll add that towards the end. I suggest some quick drying fabric glue, permanent fabric glue. That's what I glue my Decaville in place with. I don't fuse it, I glue it in. I use a stapler to staple the seams. You can install a label if you wish. The other thing I recommend is double-sided tape. This is just a 6mm, 1/4 of an inch wide tape, and it's the wash-away type, which doesn't gum up your needle. And I use that for installing zippers. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to get our strap support ready. We just need our Decaville 1 heavy strap support and our boning. And onto the non-glue, that's the non-shiny side, we're going to clip this Rigoline boning, and I'm using it with the curve which is going towards me like that. It will straighten out a bit when you press your strap a little bit, but you don't want to press this boning too much because it is plastic and it will melt, and ask me how I know. But you don't have to be real fussy with pegging this exactly in the center because it doesn't have to be exact. We're just getting it roughly in the center, and then you can adjust it a bit at the sewing machine as well when you're stitching it into place. Like that. So now we're going to head over to the sewing machine and stitch it on. So now we're just going to stitch our boning in place. It's a little fiddly to get started, but once you do, it's easy. And you shouldn't have any trouble stitching through it. I just use a long stitch length of 3.4, which is my top stitching length. And start back a bit from the end and just reverse up, and away I go. Just like that. And now we're going to make our strap. So retrieve your strap, and what we're going to do is we're going to go over to the ironing board. We're going to press a crease in half, and then we're going to fold into that center and press, and same on this other side, and press like that, and then we're going to fold it over and press, and then come back here and I'll show you what I do next. Okay, so now that we have pressed our strap like that, grab our boning again, and we're going to place this boning with the fusible side down, and we're going to wrap the fabric around it like this and clip to hold. I'm going to do that all the way to the other end. And yes, it is a little fiddly because that boning wants to move around. Like that. Now we're going to go over to the sewing machine and we're going to top stitch down both long edges. So I'm going to put my walking foot on. I recommend using a walking foot if you have it for straps. I just find that it does a better job. Retrieving the strap. Now I'm going to stitch 3 millimeters, 1/8 of an inch from the side, and I'm stitching on the Deckerville side up, the smooth, flattest side. 3 millimeters, 1/8 of an inch from the edge, stitch length of 3.4. Trying to keep the edges aligned as you go. Like that. So now we're going to make our zipper pocket. So we need our zipper pocket facing and our zipper pocket pieces, 2 lining and 2 interfacing, and our zipper, number 3 zipper. So on the back of your zipper pocket facing you need to draw your box for your window, and I've already drawn mine on here, so just refer to the pattern to get your measurements. Now retrieve a lining body piece, just one of them, like that. Just fold in half to get a halfway mark, and I have some little halfway marks on there, so I can put that on there. So now we just need to grab our ruler and we're going to put this 3/8 of an inch down from the very center here. My ruler's upside down. So just make sure that it's level at the top there. Line that up in the middle and pin it in place. Like that. Now we're going to go over to the sewing machine and we're going to stitch the top line and the bottom line, beginning and ending at those end points. So now we're going to stitch our zipper facing in place. I'm using a stitch length of 2.4 and I'm going to stitch both lines beginning and ending at the end points. Like that. Just remember to keep trimming away your threads as you go so that everything stays looking nice and neat. Now we need to cut this middle line. I'm just going to start it off with my stitch rip. I'm just going to snip down the center. Snip out to where my stitch is, but do not snip your stitch. And if you do happen to snip your stitch, you just need to go back over to the sewing machine and re-stitch. Like that. Now over at the eye end, just press each side of your facing towards the center like so, just to give it a nice crease. And now grabbing a friction pen, we're just going to eyeball and mark approximately 6 millimeters, 1/4 of an inch back from each end. Doesn't have to be exact. And now we're going to go over to the sewing machine and we're going to stitch each side of the facing between those two marks. Okay, so now we're going to stitch right next to the fold. I'm just going to leave it at my top stitch length of 3.4. Get this thread out of the way. Just going to start on the mark right next to the fold. Holding the thread so I don't get a big nest underneath. Doesn't matter if you go a bit past the mark like I just did. Like that. And now that we have our window ready, we'll just set that aside for the minute and we're going to work on our zipper pocket pieces. Retrieving the double-sided tape. Just going to run that along both top edges. Now set one aside, and with our zipper wrong side down onto the right side of the pocket, centered left to right, I'm just going to fasten that into place like that. Press to stick it down. Now we're going to go over to the sewing machine and we're going to stitch with a zipper foot 6 millimeters, 1/4 of an inch from the edge. Now I'm just swapping to my zipper foot, moving my needle over, setting my stitch length back to 2.4. stitching 6 millimeters 1/4 of an inch from the edge. Now, as you can see, I have pressed my fabric away from the zipper like that. So retrieve your second piece. I'm going to stick it down right sides together, aligning these side edges, top edge of the zipper along the top raw edge of the zipper pocket piece. Like so. Now we're going to go over to the sewing machine and stitch using a 6 millimeter 1/4 of an inch seam. Okay, so now we're going to stitch the second side of our zipper, 6 millimeter 1/4 of an inch seam, stitch length 2.4. Like that. Now going over to the ironing board, I'm going to press the fabric away from the zipper like that. So now that we have our fabric pressed away from our zipper, we need to retrieve our body lining with the zipper facing attached, and we're just going to grab our double-sided tape again and run a strip along the top and bottom edge of the window. Now this is optional, but I like to also dab a little tiny bit of glue, well, fray stopper, in the corners of that window. Now we're going to put the closed side of the zipper on the left, but you can do it the opposite way if you want your zipper opening from the other side. And we're just going to center this so the facing is even with your zipper, and wrong side down onto the right side of the zipper, wrong side of your pocket fabric. And we're just going to line everything up so that it sits even. When you're happy that your zipper is sitting evenly in the window, just put a couple of pins or clips to hold your pocket out of the way, and we're going to stitch all the way around our window. Okay, so now we're going to stitch all the way around our window. I'm going to use a stitch length of 3.4, my top stitch length. Now you can either pull your threads back to the underside to knot off afterwards, or you can back stitch, which is what I'm going to do, just to lock those threads in place. But if you prefer to pull the threads through afterwards, that's entirely up to you. Now I just like to stitch backwards and forwards a little bit here just to secure the end of the pocket. Finishing up where you started. Like that. Okay, so now that we have our pocket stitched in place, we need to bring that pocket fabric down, smooth it down, and I'm just going to stick a couple of pins in the sides just to hold it for the moment. And I'm going to trim this and this bottom and top pieces of extra fabric off. Like that. Woohoo. Now we're going to fold under the seam allowance on the bottom edges of the pocket and press or stick it down with double-sided tape like I'm going to. I'm actually going to do both, press it and double-sided tape it. Just find it holds better. Flip that over so I can get it even. Like that. Now we're going to leave this bottom bit open and we're going to stitch those two sides only, and we're going to stitch it from this lining right side up and stitching those two little V's at each end as well, just to make that a little bit more secure as well. But we're leaving the bottom of the pocket open here so that we can close our body lining through that at a later stage. Okay, so while I've got my zipper foot still on here, I'm just going to stitch these little V's on each end of the zipper close to the lining but not stitching through the lining. I'm going to set my stitch length back to 2.4. That. Same on this side. Like that. And I'm going to change my foot back to my normal foot. Put my needle back in the center. And I'm going to stitch the side of my pocket using a 1 centimeter 3/8 of an inch seam. That's from the pocket, not from this zipper part. You can trim that off if you find that easier to get your seam allowance right. Just trim that even with your pocket. Do that on this side as well. It's up to you, you don't have to do that, but it just makes it easier to get your seam allowance right. 3/8 of an inch, 1 centimeter. It ends up about where my stitching is across my V's anyway, so all good. You can't have it too secure at the end of the zipper and anyway. It doesn't really matter this seam, whether that's exactly 1 centimeter or not at either side of the pocket, because nobody's going to know. And there we have it. So now that we have our pocket ready, it's open at the bottom here, sides are stitched, everything's good to go. We'll set that aside and retrieve our slip pocket pieces. Now what we're going to do is flip that over and we're going to run some double-sided tape, or you don't have to use double-sided tape. You can just simply press the side edges under. I always put it back in the packet because I just find that keeps it stickier longer. Now to make sure that I get these even, I like to put them right sides together and clip at the top or side. Clip at one side like so, and then I can make sure I get the edges even like that. And you can press with an iron as well if you wish. But now we're going to go over to the sewing machine and stitch the top and the bottom. I start back from the edge so that when I snip my threads off I haven't got a little sticky out piece of thread sticking out. back stitch to the end. Okay, so now that we have stitched and we have a tube, we're going to turn that right sides out. Now here you can decide whether you want to have a pocket that has your exterior fabric as the pocket and the lining as the band, or having your lining as the pocket and your exterior fabric as the band, and that's what I'm going to do. So feeling where you've got your seam allowance underneath, it'll give you a guide where to fold and press that top band so it's the width of your seam allowance at 1 centimetre 3/8 of an inch wide, and just run your finger along the bottom seam allowance just to push that down so it's all sitting flat, and then we're going to go over to the ironing board and press that thoroughly. So now that I have pressed my pocket, I'm going to go over to the sewing machine and top stitch on the band, top band side, pretty close to the edge all the way along. Okay, so top stitch length of 3.4, and I'm going to stitch pretty close to the folded edge of my top band. Like that. Okay, so now that we have top stitched our top band, we need to retrieve our second body lining piece, and we're just going to fold that in half to find the center, especially down the bottom, but all the way. Now we're just going to fold this in half, and I'm just going to put a pin in just to mark the top center and the bottom center, like that. And retrieving my ruler, I'm going to place this pocket 2 centimeters 3/4 of an inch up from this bottom edge. So just line that up, line up the pin with the center mark, and pin in place, making sure that center mark is centered in that crease up there. I'm going to pin the sides. Now we're going to go over to the sewing machine and stitch all the way around those 3 sides, and I'm just going to back tack several times at this top because that's a high stress point. Okay, so now we're going to stitch our pocket in place, 3 millimeters 1/8 of an inch from the edge, top stitch length of 3.4, and I'm just going to secure the top ends by stitching backwards and forwards a couple of times. Like that. Retrieve our zipper gussets and our number 5 zipper tape, and what we need to do is mark the center of our tape at the top and bottom. I'm just marking the back side because sometimes once you put the double-sided tape on it you can't see through it to see the marks. So I've just marked the back of that center, and we need to mark the center backs of all these pieces. On one long edge of these. You don't need to mark both edges, just the one that's going to be at the top or closest to the zipper. Like that, all 4 pieces are marked in the center, as is your zipper tape. So we'll just set those pieces aside, and keeping one of our exterior pieces, I'm just going to grab some double-sided tape and run it along the top edge of the zipper on the right side. Now if you have a wavy zipper tape, give it a press either side of the teeth before you start doing this. Now we're just going to line this up with that centre mark. Press and work your way outwards on either side, pulling your fabric nice and taut, but not too taut, just needs to be nice and straight. You don't want it pulling, but you don't want it loose either. Like that. Now flip it over, run some double-sided tape along that same edge, right from the outer edge. Retrieve a lining piece and line that up in that centre mark and smooth it outwards in the same way, lining up those raw edges. And just press that to stick it down. Now we're going to go over to the sewing machine and we're going to stitch the entire length using a 6mm 1/4 inch seam. Now I'm just going to swap over to my zipper foot. Move my needle over. Now I'm going to stitch using a 6mm 1/4 inch seam, stitch length of 2.4. Like that. Now I'm going to go over to the iron and press our fabric away from the zipper on both sides. Now that you've done that, just make sure that you've got a nice even gap, in even distance, that everything's nice and even there. And now we're just going to grab some clips and just clip the two raw edges together of the zipper gusset pieces, just to hold it in place. I don't want them to slip. Now we're going to go over to the sewing machine and top stitch 3mm 1/8 inch down that long edge and baste those other three sides together with a 3mm 1/8 inch seam. So in other words, simply top stitch all the way around. So now I have just put top thread in that matches my top zipper gusset, and my bobbin thread matches my bottom lining piece. So I'm just going to stitch now 3mm 1/8 inch from the edge all down this zipper tape side first, and I'm using a stitch length of 3.4, and I'm stitching right from the end of the gusset. Like that. Now I'm just going to stitch around the other three sides as well, just to baste them together. Needle over, and that's just going to go all the way around. Three millimeters 1/8 inch from the edge. Like that. Now I've got a bit of extra overhang of my lining there, so I'm just going to trim that off so it's even. Okay, Okay, so now that we have done that, we need to repeat this process for the second side, and I've lost my halfway mark when I pressed because I'm using a friction pen, so I'll just remark that like that. Now grab some double-sided tape, run it along the top edge. Like so. Now we're going to go over to the sewing machine and stitch. Okay, so I'm going to stitch using a 6mm 1/4 of an inch seam, and my stitch length is back down to 2.4. Now I'm just going to go over to the ironing board and press my fabric away from the zipper. Okay, so now that I have pressed my fabric away from the zipper, I'm just going to put some clips to hold those raw edges together like that, and we're going to go over to the sewing machine, stitching 3mm 1/8 of an inch down the length of the zipper gussets on the zipper tape side, and then basting the other 3 edges together with a 3mm 1/8 of an inch seam. Okay, so now I'm just going to stitch this seam, top stitch length of 3.4, 3mm from the edge. Now we're just going to baste all the way around the other sides. There, we have our zipper gusset ready. Okay, so now we need to retrieve our ruler, and we're just going to mark 1 inch or 2.5 centimeters from each end. I'm just going to draw a line with a fading marker, friction pen, chalk, something like that. Same on this end. Flip it over and do the same on the lining side. Like that. So you've got them marked on both sides. Now we're just going to separate our zipper. Set one piece aside like that. Now with this facing you, we're just going to find the center and mark the center. That. Retrieve one of your exterior body pieces. I'm just going to fold that in half and mark the center top. I just mark on both sides, and I won't have any problem when it comes to putting it on. I'll be able to find the mark. So now retrieve your double-sided tape, and we're going to run a strip between these top marks here with the teeth towards you. Pull the tape off. Now retrieving your body, we're just going to grab a scissors, and we're just going to snip in 3mm 1/8 of an inch or so, 1 centimetre apart, all the way around the curve. Doesn't have to be extremely accurate. Just don't clip in too far, because we don't want to clip into our where we're going to stitch. Like that. Now right side down, we're just going to put that at the top 1 inch mark. I'm just going to put a clip in there to hold that there and there. Just going to stretch this out and mark it, line it up with the center mark. Putting the raw edges together. Put a clip. Now we're just going to gently stretch this out and get those raw edges even and stick that down. That, and do the same on this side. Now if you don't think your double-sided tape's going to hold real well, you can stick in a couple of clips. So you just want to have those raw edges as even as possible. This particular roll of double-sided tape doesn't seem to be as strong as the normal one I use. Now we're just going to go over to the sewing machine and we're going to baste that in place using a 6mm 1/4 inch seam. Okay, so now I'm just going to baste this in place using a 6mm 1/4 inch seam. The stitch length doesn't really matter here because we're just basting it. So just going to baste it at 3.4, the top stitch length from before. It's not quite even, so I'm just going to readjust that. Like that. Okay, so now that we have that basted in place, we need to turn that over and run some double-sided tape on the lining side between those two marks. Some batches of double-sided tape are better than others. This one's not a particularly good one. Retrieving one of the lining pieces, doesn't matter which one, unless you want to, you have a particular front and you want to match up the pocket side that goes on the other side of it. Now I'm just going to mark this. Well, I can see where the center is there from before. I'm just going to put a mark there and on this side, so I have no trouble finding my mark. And I'm just going to make little snips into the lining like before. 3mm 1/8 inch from the edge, about 1 centimetre apart. Like that. Match up my centre. Match up my top. Now I'm going to go over to the sewing machine and stitch that seam using the full 1 centimetre 3/8 inch seam. So now I'm going to stitch my seam and I'm going to use my full 1 centimetre 3/8 inch seam and I'm going to use a stitch length of 2.4. Like that. So now that we have stitched our seam, and if you've checked to make sure you've kept a nice even seam allowance, and if you've gone anywhere that's less than your 1 centimetre 3/8 of an inch seam, just make sure you just fix that. And now what we're going to do is trim our seam back to 1/4 of an inch or 6 millimeters. We'll start from about here. Like that. Now you can either notch in your curves, which just means cutting a little V in, but you've got to be careful you don't cut your stitches, and if you suspect you cut your stitches anywhere, you need to go back and fix it. But you need to make little notches all the way around, or like I prefer to do is I grab my pinking shears and I trim my curves with those, and it's a lot easier and it does a great job. Like that. Now we're just going to finger press, or you can go over to the iron if you're using fabric and press your fabric away from your zipper gussets, but I'm just going to finger press. And the exterior, nicely press that. And then I'm just going to clip. If you're using fabric, you can pin, and if you're not, then just use some clips. Try and hold that lining so that it's nicely pulled down, because you don't want that to roll up when you're stitching in the next step. So we like to keep that nice and even. There's a pin from this side. So I'm just going to, because I'm using fabric, I'm just going to smooth it and pin it in a few spots just to hold it while I do top stitching in this next step. But otherwise, for anybody using vinyls or leather, just do some clipping. Now I'm going to go over to the sewing machine and I'm going to top stitch 3 millimeters 1/8 of an inch all the way around that curve. Okay, so now I'm going to top stitch around this curve. I've changed to a top thread which is white, so it stands out less. If I'm a bit wonky, you don't see it as much as if I was using a strong contrasting thread. So I'm going to use a stitch length of 3.4. And I'm just going to periodically check that my lining is not moving and rolling in the road underneath. So, and it's 3 millimeters 1/8 of an inch from the edge. Like that. Okay, so now that we have done that and we have our lining at the back all stitched nice, we can set that aside and repeat the process for our second zipper gusset and body lining and body exterior pieces. Like that. So now we're just going to go over to the sewing machine and baste in place using a 6 millimeter 1/4 of an inch seam. so now I'm just going to baste this in place using a 6mm 1/4 of an inch seam, and I've just got a top stitch length of 3.4 still on there. It's only basting, so it doesn't matter. Okay, so now that we have basted that in place, we need to attach our lining. Wrong side down. Like that. Now we're going to go over to the sewing machine and stitch using our full 1cm 3/8 of an inch seam. Okay, so now we're going to stitch with our full 1cm 3/8 of an inch seam, stitch length of 2.4. Like that. So now we need to trim or notch our seams. I'm just going to trim it back first because it makes it easier when I use the pinking shears. If I had sharp pinking shears, it would be easier. Like that. So now we need to go over to the sewing machine and top stitch 3mm 1/8 of an inch from the edge all the way around that seam. Okay, so now I'm going to top stitch 3mm 1/8 of an inch from the edge of the seam. If you haven't used pins, you need to check under there all the time to make sure that your lining is staying back from the zipper gusset. You don't want to stitch it over into the wrong place. Stitch length of 3.4, 3mm 1/8 of an inch from the edge. Now that we have top stitched, what I like to do with both pieces, if you want to install a label, now's a good time to do it. Just remember to put your lining out of the way. You don't want to stitch your label to your lining, or if you're using ones with prongs, etc. So what I like to do now is I like to fold this seam and get a hammer. I can't do it here on this table, otherwise it'll shake the whole thing to pieces, but I go over to a hard spot and I just fold that on that seam line there, and I give it a few good whacks with a hammer all the way around. Just helps to get that to sit nicer if it's whacked with a hammer. So I shall go away and do that to both of these. Now that I have hammered my seams, we can set those aside and work on our gussets. Just grab your exterior gussets and we're going to place those right sides together and either pin or clip those two raw edges together So now we're going to go over to the sewing machine and stitch with a 1 centimetre 3/8 of an inch seam. Okay, so now we're going to stitch our gussets with a 1 centimetre 3/8 of an inch seam, and our stitch length is 2.4. Like that. So now what we need to do is press the seam open. You can go over to the ironing board and do that, or press with your fingers. I'm just going to press with my fingers. And now I'm going to top stitch 3 millimeters 1/8 of an inch on either side of the seam with a stitch length of 3.4. Like that. Now that we have our gusset seam pressed open and stitched, we need to retrieve our body pieces again, and we're just going to fold them in half to find the center bottom of the exterior piece and mark it. Same with the other side. Like that. So now we're going to attach the gusset to one side first. If you have a front and back, I suggest attaching it to the front, because when we top stitch around the gusset, it's easier to do it on the first one that we do. So we'll start with the front, and now we'll match up those marks with the center seam. Pin or clip. As I'm using fabric, I'm going to pin because it holds it more securely. Just going to bring that around, and with the lining just clip it to the gusset just to keep it out of the way, because we don't want that caught in our stitching. Bring the exterior around and clip that or pin at the top. And we'll work our way from the center out to the corner. Once it starts to curve, then we're going to look at stapling and clipping. But first we'll do this other side, down to the point where it starts to curve. And now we're going to grab a scissors. We're going to make 6 millimeter 1/4 of an inch seams or so. 6 millimeter or 1/4 of an inch snips into the seam, approximately 1 centimeter apart. It also helps to roll that lining up and clip it out of the way. And I'm going to use a stapler just to help hold this in place. I'm just going to spread that around there. Like that. Now we're going to go over to the sewing machine and we're going to stitch all the way around that seam. Okay, so now we're going to stitch using a 1 centimeter 3/8 of an inch seam and a stitch length of 2.4. I've gone off the seam allowance, but I'll fix that afterwards. sure your lining's out of the way because we don't want to stitch that into the seam. Now back here somewhere I didn't maintain my seam here. Just need to fix that because I've gone really wonky. Like that. So now we have to remove some staples. There, when you've removed all your staples. Now I'm going to use pinking shears. I'm turning it over this side so I'll make sure I don't pink into my lining. I'm just going to trim this all the way around. So now what we need to do is finger press our seam towards the gusset. Just go around and press that all the way around that gusset seam going towards the gusset. And now we're going to go over to the sewing machine and we're going to top stitch with the seam towards the gusset, 3mm 1/8 of an inch from the edge all the way around. Just keep making sure that you've got your seam towards the gusset. Okay, so now I'm going to top stitch 3mm 1/8 of an inch from the edge of the seam, and the gusset seam is pressed, but the seam is pressed towards the gusset, and I'm going to try and make sure it stays that way. I'm using a stitch length of 3.4, and you can just go slow and just keep checking. You can kind of feel it with this hand here as you go. Kind of just pull the fabric so that it all sits nice. Okay, so now we need to do our second body piece. So retrieve that, and I'm just going to peg this lining up out of the way. Clip. Same with this one on this side here. Just want to make sure that that stays out of the way. Yeah, like that. Now, right sides together, line up that centre body with the centre gusset, and pin or clip. Only clip if you are using vinyl or leather or something like that. Then you cannot use pins. Well, you can if you keep them in the seam allowance. It's safer if you don't. Okay, like that. So we've got that pinned and clipped all the way around. So now we just need to go and stitch. Okay, so now we're going to stitch the second side using a 2.46 stitch length and a 1 centimeter 3/8 of an inch seam. Just keeping all these clips and things out of the way. Just make sure that they've stayed relatively accurate at the top there. A little bit of slippage won't matter, but there we go. Check you haven't gone too wonky anywhere. If you have, fix it. Okay, so now that we have stitched our second side, I need to remove some staples. Now, this second side's a little bit more tricky, but if you take your time, it's not that tricky. So press the seam towards the gusset, seam allowance towards the gusset, finger pressing inside there. I know you can't see what I'm doing, but I'm just doing the same thing I did before. I'm just running my fingers around the seam, finger pressing that so that the seam heads towards that gusset. Now we're going to go over to the sewing machine and stitch around the second side of the gusset. This side's a little bit more tricky, but we're going to do the same thing and stitch 3 millimeters 1/8 of an inch from the edge on the gusset side, keeping our seam allowance pressed towards the gusset. Stitch length is 3.4. And just keep checking that your lining's out of the way and everything else is out of the way and the seam allowance stays towards the gusset. It's a little bit more fiddly, but that was a workout. Nah, it's not that bad, but it does look a lot better. This bag sits a lot nicer if you make the effort to do that seam. Okay, so now that we have done that, we need to get rid of these clips for now. And we're just going to turn that so it's right side out. And you can start to see how awesome your bag's looking, even if it does need a press right now. Just run your fingers around there, just smooth it out. Okay, so now what we need to do is get this lining out so it's out of the way, and this one on this side, like that. And retrieve your Decaville base support, and now just going to mark the halfway point. I just do that by folding my paper in half and putting some marks on the wrong non-glue side, or on the rough non-glue side, like that. And now onto the glue side we're going to add glue. Because it's too hard to fuse, and it was a lot easier to assemble that bag without having that gusset with Decaville in place. Now I just need a stick. Just going to smooth this out. A fast drying fabric glue is perfect for this, a permanent one, so that it stays put. And fast drying, so you can have a cuppa and then come back and keep working. It helps if you open the lid. Let's put a bit more glue there. Normally I put paper down so I don't get it everywhere. There we go. And now we're just going to put that inside our bag, lining up those marks with that center seam at the bottom. Just press that firmly in place, like that. And now I'm just going to add some weight so it holds till it dries. I'm going to have a cup of tea, or coffee, or perhaps a glass of wine. I'm just going to retrieve my gusset lining pieces, and we're going to put that right sides together and stitch the bottom seam like we did with the exterior. Okay, so I'm going to stitch using a 1 centimetre 3/8 of an inch seam. Okay, so now with a stitch length of 2.4 and a seam allowance of 1 centimetre 3/8 of an inch, I'm going to stitch this seam. Like that. Now I'm going to finger press the seam open. Over, and now I'm going to top stitch 3 millimeters 1/8 of an inch from the edge on both sides of the seam, and I'm going to put my stitch length back up to 3.4. like that. So now that we have top stitched our gusset and got that ready, we need to retrieve our bag assembly, and we're going to turn it lining side out, and working on the side with the zipper pocket first, we're just going to mark the center bottom. As we'll mark both sides first. Like that. Now we're going to work from the side with the zipper pocket though, and we're going to start by pinning or clipping at the bottom. Bring the other end around, and if you happen to not have enough space there, you can taper that off a little bit If you can't get your full seam allowance there, it doesn't matter. Sometimes if we go a bit out of whack with our seams, it gets a bit narrow here, but see how you go. Okay, so now we have done that, I'm going to go over to the sewing machine and stitch all the way around. So now we're going to stitch our body lining gusset. I'm just going to fold this all out of the way. I'm stitching with a stitch length of 2.4, 1 centimetre, 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Make sure your zipper pocket is out of the way underneath. Now just go around and inspect your seam, and if all is good, we'll just go and remove some staples. If anything's wonky and you need to fix it now. Okay, so now that we have done that, we need to remove some staples. Like that. Now trim the seam back to 6 millimeters, 1/4 of an inch, and notch the curves or use pinking shears. So now that we've done that, we need to do our second side of the lining. So we're going to match up the center marks. And just put a pin in there to hold at the bottom. And do the sides, just move all that stuff out of the way. Might help to stick a clip here because it does tend to pull a lot here. And if you can't maintain all of the seam allowance up this end, it doesn't really matter. Because it's all inside the bag and nobody's going to see it. Because it does tend to want to pull a bit here. See how it wants to pull? Now if that's happening to you, do not worry if it doesn't line up 100% because doesn't really matter. I'm just going, for the sake of this video, trying to get it right. But I'm not going to lose any sleep over it. It's all hidden in the top of the bag anyway. And if it is pulling, it just probably means that you've made the seam allowance a bit wider at some point during the stitching. So what I like to do here at where it starts to curve, which is just outside that pocket line there, I'm going to put 2 pins. This is to mark the point where I'm going to stop because I'm going to leave this bottom open for turning. then we're going to close that opening through the bottom of our zipper pocket. Now we're going to clip these edges and staple like before. There. So now that we have that pinned, we're going to go over to the sewing machine and stitch. So now I'm going to stitch using a stitch length of 2.4, 1 centimetre seam allowance. Don't stress if you can't maintain your full seam allowance here. Two pins, so I'm just going to back tap to lock that off. Move over to the other side. Remove my pins and away I go. So now we need to remove our staples, trim off these threads. Once you've removed your staples, trim your seam back. Don't trim the whole way, just up to your stitching. Now we need to turn our bag through our lining. There. Now we need to grab the lining through the hole in our zipper pocket, pull the lining back out like that. So like that, and now we're going to pin to hold that. Like that, and now we're going to go back over to the sewing machine and stitch that seam. So let's stitch the bottom of our lining closed, starting at our previous stitching. Just going to start a little bit back from it in case I've popped any stitches, and stitch. Stitch length is 2.4. Seam allowance of 1 centimetre, 3/8 of an inch. Just make sure everything's folded out of the way underneath. So now that we have done that, we need to push that back inside. Push our lining back down in there. And we're going to close the hole in the bottom of our pocket, the zipper pocket. I like to trim these corners back off a little bit. Just like that. And now line up the edges. Like that. Now we're going to go over to the sewing machine and stitch that seam. So now we're going to stitch this close to the edge of the seams, the folds, using a stitch length of 3.4. Try and keep those edges aligned. Now just inspect your pocket to make sure that you have caught both sides of the seams, and if not, fix it and then you're good to go. Okay, so now that we have done that, we need to push our pocket down into there properly, down inside the bag, like that. Now if you find that feels lumpy, you can go away and give that a few good whacks with the hammer in there to make that sit flatter. And then we will set that aside and work on our strap cuffs. So retrieve your strap cuffs. Now we're going to place each of these two of them right sides together like that. And pin the top and bottom edges or clip. Like so. And now we're going to go over to the sewing machine and we're going to stitch the top curve, the bottom curve of each one using a 6mm 1/4 inch seam. So now we're going to stitch our strap cuffs. We're going to stitch using a 6mm 1/4 inch seam and a stitch length of 2.4. Top and bottom. Like that. And the second one. Like that. So now we're going to go and trim some seams. So now we need to trim these seam back or notch your curves. I'm going to use pinking shears. Like that. Now grabbing a scissors, all we're going to do is we're going to cut down the center of each of one piece. So we're not cutting through both layers, we're only cutting through one layer, like that. Doesn't have to be accurate, but as you can see, I'm only cutting the one layer. Doesn't have to be neat or a specific width, just roughly down the center. Like that. And then the same with the second one, only one layer. So now we are left with two cuffs like that. So what we need to do is we're going to go over to the sewing machine and we're going to understitch. So finger press that seam and piece towards the piece of cut fabric. so all the way, and then we're going to understitch around there. The same on this one, pressing that seam towards the cut fabric and finger press that, and we're going to go and understitch there, so that's right next to the seam but on the facing side, because that's the facing, that will be the facing, and we're going to do the same with this one. Okay, so now we're going to go over to the sewing machine and understitch right next to those seams. So now we're going to understitch with our seam pressed towards the facing, on the facing side close to the previous seam, and I'm going to use a stitch length of 3.4. Just keep pulling your fabric out so it stays, so that it doesn't roll under on you. Second side. Like that. And that's going to fold nicely. Since it's understitched, it'll make it much easier to press and get a nice fold. So I'll do the same on this side. Like that. So now that we have pressed our cuffs, we're just going to flip them over to the wrong side and just trim a little bit of extra fabric away on one of the sides. It's just so that they don't bulk up in the middle. Like that. What we're going to do now is go over to the sewing machine and we're going to top stitch each of these curves. Okay, so now we're going to top stitch either side curve. I'm going to top stitch 3 millimeters, 1/8 of an inch from the edge. I'm going to put my zipper foot on because it just makes it easier to get an even little top stitch. Because the zipper foot's the right width. So I'm stitching with a stitch length of 3.4. That, and now do the second one. Second side. Like that. Retrieve our strap and our bag. Now we need to put our pull on. So have a look inside and see which side your zipper pocket is opening and closing from. And when on the side where it's closed from is the side we're going to put our pull on. So like that. So now retrieving one end of the strap with the curve like so. So it's over the top of the bag. We need to place this in between the lining and the exterior, and we'll put it in until you can feel it just at the point where it's above the zipper, and then we're going to wrap those gussets. No, we're going to wrap the zipper gussets around the strap like that and peg it on or clip it on so that holds. And what we're going to do is we're going to go over to the sewing machine and we're going to stitch a few rows of stitches above the zipper here and a few rows of zipper be above the body assembly on that side. So basically backwards and forwards here to secure everything in place, and then we will either glue the ends of the zipper, or you can stitch them if your machine is capable, just to secure them off. Okay, so now we're just going to secure this strap in place. Just check that it's sitting even at the other side. I'm just going to start on the bottom side. I'm going to do a stitch length of about 3. You don't have to worry about this being neat, no one's going to see it. That's what the strap cups are for. Like that. Don't worry that it's messy. That's the whole purpose of the strap cuffs, is to hide that. Now if your machine is capable, just stitch across the top ends of the zipper tape just to fasten that and lock it off. If you don't think your machine can do it, you can just add some glue. But since we've kept the boning just above the zipper tape, you should be fine with that. Like that. Okay, so now that we have done that, we're just going to trim away some of this excess zipper gusset pieces. Like that. Doesn't not have to be neat. So now retrieve one of your strap cups, and what we're going to do is wrap it around the strap with the big curve down the bottom there like that, because we're going to test the fit. So we need to have it like so, and I'm just going to peg those raw ends together to hold this. Now slide it down until it's covering about 1 centimetre, 3/8 of an inch of your zipper, so you can't see anywhere where you're gluing or stitching, and it's got to cover your straps at the top, your zipper gussets. Now just pinch it, and you want it to move a bit, so allow a little bit of movement there. You don't want it too tight a fit. And we're just going to mark that, so if it's snug up against there, it's probably a couple of millimeters out from the strap, or 1/16, or if you're using thick fabrics, maybe 1/8 of an inch, 3 millimeters out. And at the bottom, pinch that right in, mark it again, and take that off. And we're just going to peg that together and draw a line from those 2 marks. And that's where we're going to stitch. You can double check that that's going to be right. And now we're going to do the same with the other one. Now that we have done that, we need to go over to the sewing machine and stitch those lines. Putting my stitch length at about 2.4. Going to stitch on that line. Same with this one. Like that. So now that we have stitched those, we need to, so we're just going to trim this seam back like that and finger press that open. You can even give these ends a good whack with the hammer just to flatten them, which I'm going to do. So I flattened that. Now I'm going to turn that right sides out like that. And now that is going to slip over my strap. Now we want the seam on the inside, and the wide part goes on first, because that's going to go down over that. Now we need to do the same with this one, because we need to put it on before we attach the second side. So I'm just going to press that open. I'm just going to whack that with the hammer and turn that right sides out like that. Now we need to slide this on with the narrow opening first, so that when we attach it, it's going to be down there, but slide it up out of the way. You can stick a clip on there just to hold that out of the way. So just double check that you have your two narrow ends facing each other like that. So now we're just going to repeat on the second side and place that between your lining and exterior. Push it in so far as till you can feel it there at the top of the zipper. Wrap those zipper gussets around your strap and clip to hold, like so. Now we're going to go back over to the sewing machine and repeat the process of stitching. Okay, so now that we've stitched that on, we're going to do the same thing, trim away some excess zipper gusset. We don't need that. Just like that. And now we can bring our strap cuffs down and double check that it's going to fit. Covering everything, same on this side. So all looking good. So what we need to do now is we're just going to add a little bit of glue so that it holds it there. We don't want it moving around and then showing off our ugliness. And if you didn't stitch the top of your zipper, just add a little bit of glue there now. But I'm just going to add a little bit of glue right here at the near the top. Same on this side. Oh, a fair bit of glue. And just slide that down over your stitching and things, all over the assembly details, all over the, I don't know what you call it, construction details, that's the word. And then when you're happy with its placement, I'm just going to clip it in place. Hiding everything on both ends. So now I'm just going to add a couple of clips at the top there where I've got my glue. and allow that to dry, and then all we have to do is some pressing to get it to sit nice and get rid of these wrinkles.